We are in a very nice JK today, and I'm going to guess it's a 2017 because it has a 10th year anniversary on the side. This JK has, and I'm going to say an LT1, but it's probably an L86. In any event, it runs awesome. This guy did a good job on this winch. I'm not too happy with this bar, but look how the majority of the grill is open to airflow. That's what you need to get cooling into these. A lot of guys ask, where's this trail? Well, that's Las Vegas way down there. Those red rocks are the backside of Red Rock Canyon. And then that's Mount Potosi, where Carol Lombard's plane crashed way back in the 1930s or 40s. Over that hill is Good Springs and then California. Let's take a quick look at this Jeep. Like I say, it's really tight, it's been done well. Looks like he's got double throwdown on this. I know I was going at pretty high speeds to Utah, and even with these tires that are well worn, it really cruised nice at high speed. Yeah, he's got a double throwdown in this, Dynatrac axles. Very nice. Notice my guys dumped the exhaust out right in front of the axle. On a lot of these builds, like with the double throwdown, where you got all the stuff up here, or the Elite, what is that? The Elite chassis from Genrite, running the fuel tank back there, there's no room for a muffler or an exhaust pipe. I have that muffler there in the stock location on my Jeep, and it's pretty quiet. But most guys want a more aggressive sound. So this is a very well done Jeep. And look here. Look how he's got a lot of opening here for air to flow out of this engine compartment. A lot of guys have these sealed off, and I remember in the early days working with some of the manufacturers and telling them you got to vent these fender wells, not just in V8s but in everything, because it traps the air in. This is a really small engine compartment, and it's got a very large engine. This morning we're in a very nice late model JK with an LT1 or L86, I'm not really sure which. They're both so similar, I can't really tell the difference. I just had this JK in Utah up by Park City, and the temperatures dipped into the single digits. And I remember coming out in the morning and trying to open the door, and when everything is frozen, sometimes that can be difficult. But the engine started right up, warmed up, got the cab warm, and the drivability was excellent. This new Type 2 10-speed, what I noticed was in some of the earlier 8-speeds, when it was really cold out, the first few shifts on a cold day could be very jerky. And I still notice that with my Denali today. After it warms up, everything is fine. But with this new Type 2 10-speed, it was smooth as glass right out of the driveway, even in single digits. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about drivability today, because you hear a lot about numbers, horsepower, 450, 475 horsepower, and torque, 400 foot-pounds of torque. We used to have something called power under the curve, and we always tried to maximize how much power we could get at different RPMs. And one of the problems with the early cams was we can get a lot of power, but we would lose drivability. I think something that is overlooked with the LT engines is, while you're comparing, let's say, a 475 horsepower Hemi 6.4 to a 460 horsepower LT1, you say, oh look, the Hemi's got more horsepower. But what you got to take into account is how much torque these LTs have and where they have it. It's not difficult to build horsepower at higher RPMs, but it is difficult to build horsepower and torque at low RPMs. Diesels, of course, are very good at that, and steam engines are very good at that. In fact, I want to give a shout out to Jay Leno. I hope he recovers quickly. I watch pretty much all of his videos, and I have been watching them for, well, probably for about a decade. So the LTs are kind of changing the game in the performance arena. Now, don't get me wrong. The technology in the LT has been around for a long time. The continuous variable valve timing, direct injection, the higher compression engines, they've all been around for a long time, but they were mostly applied to exotics or smaller engines, like the little Pentastar. The Pentastar puts out 300-ish horsepower for a 3.6 liter engine, and that's really good. But if you took the technology away from the Pentastar, you took away the variable valve timing and the higher compression and all that, what you'd end up with is basically a 3.8. And as you guys probably know, the 3.8 put out about 200 horsepower, which was fine in a lightweight minivan, but in a big heavy JK with 40s, it just didn't cut the mustard. So for years, manufacturers have been applying this technology, especially overseas, Europe, Asia, places like that, where Americans tended to stick with good old overhead valve technology. And that got us through pretty much from the 1950s to where we are today. Now, prior to the 1950s, a lot of the engines were flatheads. They ran low compression engines, 5-to-1, 4-to-1. They ran low pressure or no pressure oiling systems because they weren't under that much stress. They required a lot of maintenance, Babbitt bearings that you had to change out, and valve jobs every 30,000 miles and all that. But in the 1950s, right after the war, and the war is really where the technology came from, we saw rapid development in automotive engine. But the Americans always tend to stay conservative and stick with large displacement engines or larger displacement engines that were low stressed. In other countries, like in Europe, it was expensive to run the larger engines. Not only was fuel more expensive, but they taxed engines that were larger. In fact, I heard a rumor once that English engines had long strokes because they taxed the size of the top of the piston. So we pretty much were really happy in the 50s and then the 60s with the good old 2-valve overhead valve engines, and everybody did it. Ford did it, Chrysler, Chevy. Of course, Chrysler had the Hemi, but it was still just a standard old overhead valve 2-valve engine. In the late 50s and 60s, we wanted more power, so what did we do? First, we made the engines larger, and the engines grew to over 400 cubic inches. That was huge on the world stage. You gotta remember, Europe were running engines 1 liter, 2 liter, 3 liter. I remember working on a Honda 600 car, which essentially had a motorcycle engine in it, and you could virtually lift it out. Now, these little engines got the job done, but they were really highly stressed. They revved high. A lot of them had roller bearings and ball bearings, where the American motors had plain bearings. So they were somewhat exotic. America is a big country, and if we compare the continental US to, let's say, Japan, in Japan, you don't really need to get up to 80 miles an hour and cruise for 8-10 hours on end, because you'd go be across the whole country. And they don't have roads and interstates like we have. I remember back in the 1970s, I worked with some guys at Honda, and they were having failures on their motorcycles because even though they tested them thoroughly in Japan, when they brought them over here, you get Americans that would jump on them and go almost wide open throttle from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And the vehicles were failing because the duty cycle was so high. So what Americans tended to do was go with large displacement, low stressed engines. I had a 1971 or 72 Cadillac Coupe de Ville. The thing had a monster engine. I don't know what it was, 470 or something. It was a torque monster. Didn't matter how heavy that vehicle was, it launched. And I remember launching against even lighter cars like Porsches and taking them with that Cadillac. So the strategy worked. Gas was cheap. Production or labor of production was pretty inexpensive back in the day, and we could crank out these road monsters. I remember growing up in the late 1970s and watching all the muscle cars go to the wrecking yard. I remember seeing Hemis in the wrecking yard. I actually got a Roadrunner Hemi out of the wrecking yard. What happened in the early 1970s after the oil crisis was it was getting more and more expensive to operate these big road yachts. Now back in the 30s, 40s, the bigger the car, the better. The more prestige you had, the straight 8s, the V16s, all that. But in the early 1970s, what it came down to was money. And if you were driving a Chrysler 440, that thing was a gas guzzler. You'd be lucky to get 10 miles to the gallon in that thing. And the air conditioning weren't that efficient. They were just massive cars with a lot of metal and old technology. At the same time, the government was trying to clean up the emissions. So we have these massive engines that really weren't designed for emissions, and there was a fundamental shift. We saw a lot of Americans go over to the import cars. I remember we had to restrict import cars because they were selling so well to keep Detroit going. The big guys tried to compete. You remember the Chevy Vega and the Ford Pinto, but they really weren't successful because we had been so used to building these monster engine cars and just making the engine larger and larger and larger with low technology, that when they tried to apply that to a small, lightweight economy car, it was pretty rough at first. I would probably say the first home run was the K car from Chrysler, Iacocca. He came over from Ford. He was also the genius behind the Mustang. Basically take a Falcon, which was a mediocre car, put a cool looking body on it, and then promote it to the young people, and it was an instant hit. Just like in the turn of the previous century when the horse-drawn carriages were side by side with automobiles, and you couldn't sell even the best horse-drawn carriages because the writing was on the wall about the future of the automobile. So Iacocca did a genius stroke. He borrowed money from the government. They invested in this small car technology. They came out with a couple of 2-liter engines, 2-ish liter engines, 2.2, I think they had a 2.4. They put turbos on them. They had a Shelby version. but they made a small, economical car that worked. And they really worked those K cars. They had everything from the standard old Aries that was a plain Jane car. They had LeBaron convertibles. They had turbocharged cars. And they were extremely successful. They saved Chrysler. And they somewhat ushered America into the new generation of automobiles and got rid of the old wasteful land yachts. Now, I still have a place in my heart for those old land yachts. When you drive those things, they're pretty awesome. You go over railroad tracks and you don't even know they're there. The old Chrysler torsion bar suspension worked great, as did the old Packard. There's really nothing today that can compare to them. But if you consider how much gas you were guzzling and how inefficient they were, it was pretty obvious that they had to evolve. So from the 1980s to the 1990s, I saw a lot of transition. We saw the V6s come in. The old 3-liter GM V6 they put in all their mid-sized cars. Ford, of course, came out with a bunch of V6s, the 4-liter, the EcoBoost 3.5, which is a very high technology engine. And for the most part, they worked really well. They got better economy, but there was always that elephant in the room, and that was these massive trucks and SUVs where Americans will load a 6,000-pound vehicle with 2,000 pounds of stuff, hit the road, and go across the country at 90 miles an hour. And that's where these smaller engines just didn't work well. They weren't as efficient. They didn't have the economies of the larger displacement. Remember, there is no replacement for displacement. Yes, they can get horsepower out of them, but when it came to longevity, low stress, economy, and all that in these larger, heavier vehicles, the V8 became the norm. Now, Lexus and others, Toyota came out with V8s. They tended to be smaller, 3 liters, 4 liters, whatever. But the Americans had to break the trend of just making engines larger and larger and larger to get the job done. I remember we had big block Chevys over 500 cubic inches. Computer technology really helped a lot. Computerized fuel injection made a huge benefit to these V8s. And not only for efficiency and emissions, but for drivability. Talk to the old guys that used to wheel and climb steep hills or go down steep grades with carburetors, and what a pain that was. Fuel injection changed all that. Cold starts in the morning, not having to worry about the choke and the temperature and all that. Fuel injection combined with a good old American overhead valve V8 really became the norm, and it still is today because it is such a reliable and potent combination. The earlier generations of the Ford engines, in my opinion, like the 5 liters, remember the old EFIs that were based on the 302s, and they had the Midlands and they had the Clevelands and they had all these different engines. They suffered from the same downsides that all the other engines suffered. Now Ford has jumped into the higher technology V8 with the flat crank Coyote motor, but that's not really mainstream hauling your SUV down the road. That's more of a performance thing. What we need to look at is GM. They're the ones left holding the torch. What Chrysler did with the Hemi is they just kept improving the architecture and the platform of the Hemi, the early Hemi engine. 2 valves, hemispherical combustion chamber, and they worked it, and it worked well. In the late 1990s, GM decided to take another step by going to an all-aluminum engine with the Generation 3 LS, changing the architecture, different firing order. In fact, they did go to what was a popular Ford firing order. They dropped the block skirt down, made the engine really, really strong so it could handle the horsepower, 6-bolt mains, and that was the genesis or the start of the modern LS-LT engine. I got a lot of videos on this, so let's keep it short. The Gen 3 evolved into the Gen 4, which added variable valve timing, the 6-speed transmission, and please don't overlook these transmissions. I still get guys putting 5 speeds in Hemis, and then they drive an LS with a 6-speed and see how much better it is, and they drive a 10-speed over the 6-speed and see how much better it is. Well, we'll talk about the transmissions later, but it is a huge component in engine performance, and I am still blown away every time I drive one of these new 10-speeds. Now remember, I'm an old hot rodder. I come from the 1970s, and most of the cars I own from the 1960s. So when I drive a fully adaptive clutch-to-clutch 6-speed or 10-speed that shifts so smooth I can't tell the shifting, I always have to stop a second and appreciate that technology. So I don't want to drag out the technical side of this too long, but basically in the Gen 5, GM kind of broke the mold. Rather than just build an old architecture, overhead valve, V8 that the Americans have been doing for decades, at first making the displacement larger for the high performance engines, putting multiple carburetors on, and you can kind of think of it like a Lego. You have a basic engine that you can make anything you want. You can take a small block Chevy, put high compression heads on it, a cam in it, and put out 400 horsepower. Or you can take that same engine, put a smog cam in it, lower the compression to run at regular gas, and Aunt Mabel would drive it to the store. So the versatility was there, but what wasn't there was the horsepower along with the drivability. And that's what I'm trying to get across on these LTs. You look at numbers on paper and you say, oh look, this one's 475, this one's 450, the 475 must be better. Don't fool yourself. Look at that power, look at that area under the curve. What puts a smile on my face with these LTs when I get in them is just how much torque they have on the bottom. And the fact that the transmissions keep them in that power band all the time. You guys out there with your Escalades and Denali's know exactly what I'm talking about. You hit the throttle pretty much anywhere and you go. You're not waiting for a downshift. We had a 480 or 495 horse LS3. I think GM changed the designation in the shop recently, and we ran it against an LT. Well, it wasn't an LT1, it was an LED6. And the LED6 beat it, of course. The vehicles were similar, and the reason was bottom end torque. That LED6 got its advantage out of the hole. Now, if the race had gone on, probably the LS3 would have taken it when it got on the pipe and put its maximum horsepower out. But what you have to appreciate is you were getting near 500 horsepower with an LT1 with the drivability of a stock Jeep engine. That's how mild these are. They idle lower than a stock Jeep engine. I have LT1s idling in the 475 to 500 RPM range. You are not going to do that with a cammed 500 horsepower Hemi or LS. I guess I should say a little bit about this Jeep before I finish. It is a late model Jeep, I don't know what year. Very nice. I think it has double throwdown on it. Drives really nice on the highway, 75, 80, 85 miles an hour. It's rock solid. And with this LT1 just putting along at, I don't know, 2,000, 2,100 RPM, 80 miles an hour, it's a dream. Now even something as simple as going up a little grade like this. I remember in the V6s getting on it and having them downshift into second and then third, and they probably wouldn't even go into overdrive going up this hill. You'd have to turn the overdrive off. And this LT1 doesn't even know there's a hill here. It thinks it's flat road. The inspiration for this video is I've been listening to some of these live chats. Actually, I was requested to listen to some of these live chats. And you hear guys comparing the Hemi to the LS, to the LT and all that. And the first thing that really surprised me is a lot of these guys don't even know what an LT is. They still call it an LS. They don't realize the direct injection and the CVVT and all the other technology that's in the LT. They just bundle it all together with the LS. Secondly, they normally talk down about these new transmissions. Oh, they're too complicated, they have computers. Now, yeah, if you're gonna go out and you're gonna race in Johnson Valley, you're gonna pre-run, you're gonna do Baja, by all means, go get yourself a 4-speed LS3 or even a manual transmission. But I'm telling you, when you hit the highway and you got an LT1 with 11.5 to 1 compression and a 10-speed transmission, and you got to drive across the country, it is a dream. I just drove my Denali 6,000 miles cross country from Vegas to Utah to New York to Florida and back, and it was very low stress. I did a similar trip with my V6 JK 2009, and it was misery. It was so bad we almost sold our JK, and that was the inception of Motec. What I'm trying to get across here is the LT gives you both. It gives you the economy, it gives you the emissions compliance, it gives you the horsepower you want, but it also gives you the drivability. There is no sacrifice. Even an LS3 from the last generation of engines, I can feel the cam. It's very mild, but there is that little bit of a rump, and the idle is a little bit higher. And if you go to the previous generation, whether it's the Hemi or the small block Chevy, if you wanted to get power numbers like we're seeing today, you would have a big cam. You would be idling at 800 to 1,000 RPM. You would have a soggy bottom end, and you wouldn't get your power till the higher revs. And you would have that more pyramid-shaped torque and horsepower curve, where you were building maximum power about 4,000 or 5,000 RPM. If you look at that same chart on an LT, it's almost flat as a dinner plate. You're getting all that power on the bottom end. So you have the drivability and you have the horsepower. And I think that is something that is sorely overlooked for the guys that really don't understand what an LT is. I regularly get 14 to 16 miles to the gallon in these heavy JKs with 40s. And guys tell me, oh, you're only going to get 10, you're going to get 11, maybe 9. I had a guy in the shop yesterday, he's pulling a trailer, he's getting 6 or 7, he told me. And yeah, 15 miles to the gallon isn't stellar, but for hauling a heavy JK on 40s, up mountain grades at high altitude, I think it's great. And again, it comes down to not only the displacement of the larger V8, you have more firing pulses per revolution, but the technology of this LT. Could a 2 or 3 liter engine do it? Yeah, you put a supercharger on your 3.6 and you can have 400 horsepower, but I guarantee you it's not going to have the same drivability, longevity, sound, low stress, cruising at 90 miles an hour that a good old overhead valve American V8 is going to have. So I hope this kind of differentiates the difference between the LT and everything else out there as far as the archaic American 2-valve overhead valve design. And I'm hoping to do a video on the transmissions, because really these transmissions have had a big part in the performance of our Jeeps, and I think we need to talk more about that. In the meantime, we're going to hit the mountain with this JK, and we'll talk to you soon.